let's get underway. So welcome everyone to another Massachusetts Peace Action webinar. I'm really excited for this one tonight. If it's your first time with us, a little bit about Massachusetts Peace Action. We are the largest grassroots peace and anti-war organization in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We're part of the Peace Action Network, which has affiliates all across the country. So if you're in Massachusetts, check out masspeaceaction.org. You'll find out all the things we work on and how to get involved. If you're from another part of the country, you can go to peaceaction.org and you can find the closest affiliate to you so you can get involved in this important work. So that's us. But I'm really anxious to introduce our guest for the evening. This webinar is a book talk. We're calling it After the Apocalypse, which is the latest book by Professor Andrew Bacevich. For those of you who don't know, Andrew Bacevich is the president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's a graduate of West Point and Princeton. He served in the Army and then became an academic, and now he's a writer. He's the author, co-author, or editor of more than a dozen books. Just to name a few of them, we have The New America, Militarism, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, Washington Rules America's Path to Permanent Power, America's War for the Greater Middle East, one of my favorites, and The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. He's a professor emeritus of the IR School and History at BU, Boston University, and he's held fellowships at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the American Academy in Berlin. So without further ado, I promised I would keep your introduction short. I hope it was short enough. Without further ado, I give you Professor Andrew Bacevich. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Good job, Brian. Excellent introduction.
Thanks.
I'm delighted to be here with you. Looks like we got a good crowd, over 90 people participating in this webinar. I told Brian and Cole Harrison ahead of time that I may not be at my absolute best this evening. I had a surgical procedure done earlier today. I'm home, but have some minor after effects. But we will plow through this. The plan that Brian and I came up with is that I will present very brief remarks, my book talk, by way of introducing the book. I think Brian is then going to follow with a set of questions to get the discussion going. And then when we've worked our way through Brian's questions, we'll get on to any questions that you all have. So let me go ahead and dive into my little pitch about After the Apocalypse. And I'll begin by talking just briefly about the inspiration for the book. And I think the inspiration is pretty obvious, and it stemmed from the multiple overlapping crises that all but overwhelmed Americans, overwhelmed us during the year 2020. Of course, here we are at the end of September 2021, and I think many of us might say, well, the crises certainly didn't end when 2020 came to an end, that many of them perhaps have mutated, but continue, and therefore we continue to be in difficult times. Our country is experiencing difficult times. I chose the title After the Apocalypse for a very simple reason, and that is that I noticed as I began working on this project that the word apocalypse was appearing all over the press, and with some reason, because we were experiencing a set of apocalyptic phenomena. What am I referring to? Well, I'm referring to massive natural disasters exacerbated by the climate crisis, a vicious pandemic that back then, when I was writing the book, had no known antidote, a massive economic crisis related to the pandemic that threw millions of people out of work, destroyed millions of businesses. We're still climbing our way out of that economic hole. In 2020, we had in the White House a president who was incompetent, patently dishonest, whose very actions served to stoke divisiveness. Instead of bringing people together, he caused us to separate. And there were widespread demands for a reckoning with American racism. That in turn triggered a white backlash. So I'm 74, and I remember the worst year of our life, our collective life, as 1968. The year of the Tet Offensive, the year of assassinations, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, the year of the Democratic Party basically coming apart, the infamous Chicago Democratic National Convention. 1968 was a bad year, the one that I remember vividly. Well, 2020 was a bad year. Arguably, it was at least as bad. Some people might say it's worse. And I think there are many vantage points from which to evaluate that year. As someone with an abiding interest in the relationship between our self-claimed status as the so-called indispensable nation, the relationship between that and our conviction that we possess military supremacy. I wanted to examine how events of that year could lead us to modify our role in the world, to think differently about America's role in the world. Now, you may have noticed when Brian held up the book, it's actually a very short book. You can read the whole darn thing probably in 2.5 hours. If you read it, I hope you find it readable. Frankly, I hope you'll find it provocative. I intended it to be provocative, but I certainly did not intend it to be the last word on the events of 2020, on the apocalypse. What I tried to do was to use as a vehicle to prompt debate and discussion. Now, let me admit, as somebody who writes about foreign policy, let me admit that I have very few expectations of members of the so-called blob, that is to say, the foreign policy establishment. I have very few expectations of members of the blob welcoming any debate over our role in the world. And I did not write this book for the blob. I did not write this book for members of my generation, of baby boomers. I wrote it, I think I say this up front, I wrote it for younger Americans who may well be shocked and baffled by the disasters that have befallen our country of late. And I think they should be shocked and baffled. In the 30 or so years since members of my generation, the baby boomers, since we concluded, this is at the end of the Cold War, since we concluded that history had ended with us, the American, with the ultimate victor, my generation has, I think, made a hash of things. And given my personal background, Brian alluded to some of it, and my professional interests, I've long since concluded that our nation's grotesque misuse of military power provides one, not the only, but one important explanation for how things went so wrong as we come up to 2020. And I think the evidence that we lost our way is everywhere. In the book's introduction, I write that after the apocalypse is, quoting from the book now, is a reflection on manufactured memory. Now, in a sense, all history is manufactured. History interprets the past. The answers that history offers are conditional rather than final or definitive. Underlying my book is the conviction that in the present century, in the 21st century, Americans can no longer be satisfied with interpretations that prevailed in the prior century, the 20th century, and in many respects ever since 1776. So when it comes to the American past, both distant and recent, I think we have a lot of rethinking to do. So after the apocalypse explores various manifestations rather, of manufactured memory. And in doing so, it suggests that manufactured memory be replaced with interpretations of the past that are more relevant to our present dilemmas. In other words, we need a past that helps us understand those dilemmas rather than camouflaging them. So among the topics that I talk about in this book are where to situate the United States in the larger arc of history. And in that regard, the 20th century, the so-called American century, is gone for good. And we need to recognize that. I talk about the commonplace notion that the United States is part of a larger conglomeration of nations called the West. I think it's a fiction, and I think it's not a particularly useful fiction at the present moment. I write about the effects of special relationships, and I argue that they tend to be both poisonous and confusing, making it more difficult to understand where our true interests lie. They're a diversion. I talk about the establishment's refusal to acknowledge military failure and thereby to assess its implications. Although, again, if we think about the testimony presented to the Senate and then today to the House, we may have reached a turning point in that regard. Senior military leaders acknowledging that the Afghanistan war ended in a strategic failure. No effort to camouflage that. And I think their honesty in that score is very commendable. I write about the implications of continuing to abuse nature. I write about why the Black Lives Matter movement may well mark a decisive turn in foreign policy. And I write about the difficulty of managing an empire when in denial about the empire's very existence. Now, I am quite frequently asked if I think that the American century is over, or whether the United States more broadly has entered into a period of decline. I think only time will tell. I'm agnostic on that basic question. But I am emphatic regarding the imperative of giving up on the illusions that have informed our thinking, informed the thinking of political elites ever since the end of the Cold War. So it's time to come to a more realistic and more modest understanding of our place in the great unfolding drama of human existence on planet Earth. Now, I believe that Donald Trump was far and away the worst president in the history of our republic. Yet not long after the election of 2016, before he had entered into office, a reporter asked Trump to explain his friendly attitude toward the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. He's a killer, the journalist charged. There are a lot of killers, Trump replied. You think our country is so innocent? Well, this was an extraordinary admission. It was also true. So it's past time for Americans to give up on their claim to innocence, especially when it comes to our role in the world. And I hope that after the apocalypse might contribute, at least in a small way, to supplanting outdated claims of innocence with the moral awareness that a mature nation and people need. We badly need to reimagine our past, to align it with the present moment. So with that, I'll stop. And I think we're going to now listen to Brian's questions. Brian.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to start, right at the beginning and just talk a bit more about the title. When I first started reading the book, it occurred to me that the original meaning of the word apocalypse refers to revelation, an uncovering, a revealing. And I'm wondering if you think that these three concurrent and still ongoing crises that began in 2020, or were at least so revealed to us in such a stark way in 2020, will reveal to us that we need to change our place in the world as a country, and that we need to redefine what national security means.
For sure. Absolutely. Let's start with the last point, national security. Since the beginning of the Cold War, national security has been about addressing threats out there being Western Europe, or out there being East Asia, being Southeast Asia, or being the Persian Gulf. Threats that were far away. And threats that were basically framed in military terms. National security policy meant preparing ourselves to fight in Europe, in East Asia, in the Persian Gulf, and in many cases, actually engaging in those wars. It wasn't simply a theoretical proposition; it was a real one. That's the frame I grew up in my own days as a soldier long ago. And I think I could make a case that it made sense, at least to a considerable degree. Lord knows that we committed enormous errors during the Cold War, Vietnam, the arms race, the abuses of the CIA. But one could argue that threats out there did in fact did endanger us. It seems to me that doesn't work anymore. That here in the 21st century, we are endangered. But we're not endangered by things that are out there. We're endangered by things that are back here. I ticked off some of them in my preliminary remarks. And so it seems to me that the national security paradigm needs to flip in a fairly dramatic way, so that it no longer prioritizes the threats out there, but now prioritizes those things that endanger the safety and well-being of the American people where they live, where we live. And those things are not necessarily, don't require a military response. I mean, if we take the pandemic as an example. Now, it is not my argument that therefore we can ignore everything out there. I mean, there's no question that the rise of China has brought about a major reshuffling of international politics. There's no question that the rise of a new great power does have destabilizing effects. The rise of the United States in the latter part of the 19th century had destabilizing effects. So that needs to be attended to. If we wish to have a stable world in which we don't have a bunch of big wars, we need to pay attention to how to take into account the rise of China and still maintain stability. But it seems to me that's not really a military problem. It's a diplomatic problem. So again, I think the key point here is the need for Americans to come to a new understanding of what national security implies. And then, and this is the really hard part, to get our political elites to recognize and embrace that change.
Thanks. You also talk a lot in your book about the need to sort of give up the idea of American exceptionalism, which has become something of a civic religion. Early on in the book, when you're describing the new order the new mindset that if it didn't begin, really became firm at the end of World War II. This notion that, as Madeleine Albright once said, that the United States stands taller and sees further than other nations. Can you talk a bit more about perhaps this appeal to nostalgia, the need for us to maintain our image and our prestige, and maybe that's what we're hanging on to? Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's our version of original sin. When I was teaching at BU, the first reading in lesson one, it was a course called Ideas in American Foreign Policy. The first reading in lesson one was John Winthrop's sermon of 1630, in which he posited that we, for John Winthrop, meant his followers as they prepared to establish what was to become the Massachusetts Bay Colony and would eventually become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where some of us live, that we were in special covenant with God. God had chosen us. God had chosen us for a special purpose. Were we to fail in achieving that purpose, we would be punished by God. Now, that claim of covenant and of a special mission over time lost much of its explicitly religious aspect, but the basic idea I think lived on. I know it lived on. You know, if you look at the rhetoric of Abraham Lincoln at the time of the Civil War, what was it about? This is about ensuring that government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. And we could come up with innumerable examples from other statesmen, from writers and thinkers and so on. So this insistence that we are chosen, that we have some special purpose, that we are called upon to serve, I think is pretty much hardwired into our sort of collective consciousness as Americans. And I think in the 21st century, it is flat out dangerous. And you know, when we try to understand, you know, understandably, there's a lot of talk right now about, you know, why the Afghanistan war went so terribly wrong. Why 20 years of war we lose? You know, 20 years of war, a couple $1 trillion, all these people killed, all these people wounded, all these people displaced. And we say, how could we ever have been so foolish to think that as Americans we could be able to create a legitimate, effective, flourishing nation state in Afghanistan, along with security forces that would be able to provide for the defense of the country? And the answer is, well, we thought we could do it because we're Americans, and it's nuts. So, you know, when I said in my remarks, there's a need for us to come to a more modest understanding of who we are and where we fit. I think that's what I mean. You know, we are not called upon to save the world, to save humanity, to bring history to its intended destination.
Well, what happens when, you know, foreign policy elites, members of the blob, as you described them, seem unwilling to learn the lessons of the last 20 years? In your book, you talk about plans from the different branches of the armed forces, you know, the Army plan for 2028, the Navy's plan for 2045, and so on. And they're still talking about being able to defeat any foe anywhere in the world, full spectrum dominance. Right. You know, what about the inability to learn the lessons?
Well, again, it'll be interesting to see if this moment of acknowledging failure, which I think is very healthy, it'll be interesting to see where that leads. If it's just sort of a brief acknowledgement offered to a bunch of legislators, or whether it will lead to serious reflection. I'm troubled by the fact that the national security elite is already, frankly, gung-ho about embracing great power competition as an organizing principle of US policy going forward. Great power competition really is shorthand for China as an adversary. And it's shorthand for China as an adversary requiring a military response. I think a Cold War with China would be catastrophic. If, and I'm certainly not the only one making this point, it's a very obvious point. If we really want to tackle the climate crisis, that will require a big time collaborative effort, and it ain't going to happen unless the United States and China, as the two biggest polluters on the planet, can find a way to collaborate. I don't see how it's going to be possible to collaborate on climate change if at the same time we're engaged in some kind of a competition to see who's going to be the kingpin in East Asia. So that's a troubling prospect.
It is, and you talk about in your book, in the chapter Nature Bites Back, about the difference between preferred adversaries and actual threats that we face as a country. That's the military establishment, the military industrial complex prefers adversaries like rogue states or like rival superpowers or aspiring superpowers. But I thought as a great sort of metaphor for this difference, you talked about the US Navy carrier, the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I begin that chapter by reminding readers that the last time we had a carrier knocked out of action was in 1945. Japanese kamikazes attacked the Bunker Hill, didn't sink it, caused terrible damage, killed several hundred sailors, and the Bunker Hill was able to limp back to Pearl Harbor and to a dockyard to be repaired. That was 1945. We haven't had a carrier knocked out of action since. Oops. Until we get to the story of the Theodore Roosevelt, which was knocked out of action, not by any action on the part of an enemy, but by COVID-19. And I think that is a very good example of how threats, to use that term, I'm not sure it's the right term, but how threats are changing. And as big, as powerful as the Roosevelt is, as dedicated and trained as their sailors were, COVID-19 put that aircraft carrier out of action as decisively as had the Japanese kamikazes put the Bunker Hill out of action in 1945. And there certainly is a big lesson there to be learned.
Yes, and we've been advocating during the past year and a half that the COVID-19 pandemic especially has revealed the vulnerabilities of our national security and our society generally. And, to use a slogan that you can't bomb a virus, that overinvestment in the military hasn't made us stronger, it's made us more vulnerable. Because we haven't invested in things like the NIH. But just in the past week, the House of Representatives has voted an additional $38 billion to the Pentagon. I think it's now up to $778 billion. That's over and on top of Trump's last military budget. They're talking about building an entire new class of carriers, an update on the Theodore Roosevelt that will cost billions and tens of billions of dollars. What's the disconnect there, and why haven't our politicians learned? We talked about how our military leaders haven't learned the lessons of 2020. Why haven't the politicians?
Well, I mean, let us recognize that not every politician, but certainly some number of them basically are in the pocket of the military-industrial complex. There are jobs that would be lost if there were a major reduction in the size of the United States military. That would affect campaign contributions going to members of Congress. So there's that angle. But the other angle, I think, is that, I'm repeating myself here, but the other angle is, what does national security mean? What does the phrase mean? And our political leadership, elected, appointed, throw in the media, throw in most members of most think tanks, we are conditioned to think that national security means military preparedness vis-a-vis some kind of an enemy out there. Whether it's the Taliban in Afghanistan, or whether it's the People's Liberation Army in China. Our political leaders are conditioned to believe national security means we have to prioritize efforts to deal with those problems, not the problems here at home, which could be hurricanes, which could be floods, which could be wildfires, which could be pandemics, which could be porous borders, and so on. And therefore, when it comes time to say, well, how much money should we be allocating for, the National Institutes of Health versus how much money should we be allocating for the Department of Defense, there's like no serious argument. It's taken for granted that the Department of Defense is going to get those big numbers, 750, 760, whatever it is, $1 billion per year with minimal debate. It's taken for granted that, by comparison, the National Institutes of Health are going to get much, 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 much less, because by implication, we think that what they do is much, much, much less important than what the Pentagon does. I think that thinking is utterly obsolete, but it's deeply embedded in the way our system works.
And if you're in Massachusetts and listening to this right now, I'm going to put a link in the chat. Here's a way that you can express your thanks or your displeasure at how your representatives voted on this last increase to the military budget. Professor, I just want to ask one more question before I turn it over to the audience so they can get a chance to participate. There was one thing that I underlined from the conclusion of your book. You wrote, "Tinkering won't do," and that really spoke to me because, as we were just saying, there was an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. It didn't even pass, proposing to cut our military budget by a measly 10%. That it would be great, but that to me seems like tinkering. And I'm not sure how much longer our society can last by just making changes around the margin. What you call for is something much more radical. For instance, you call for a U.S. withdrawal from NATO in the next 10 years. What kind of other fundamental changes do you think we need to make in the short term in order to adapt to a transformed world?
So let's break the world into three big pieces: Europe, Asia, and the greater Middle East. when the United States committed itself to the defense of Europe in the wake of World War II, that was an act of enlightened statesmanship. Because back then, NATO was created in 1949. Back then, Western Europe had been shattered by war, was economically a long way from real recovery. I think had been shattered morally and psychologically by the events of two successive world wars, separated only by 2 decades. So to put it bluntly, liberal democratic Europe needed our help, and we offered it, and it was right and it was important to do. So here we are in 2021. Now Europe is united. Europe has its problems, if you look what's going on in Hungary and Poland, but by and large, the continent is prosperous, the continent is stable, the continent is free. I don't think we have any serious expectations that Europe as a whole is going to, slide toward authoritarianism. And more to the point, Europe is fully capable of managing for its own fairly modest security needs. I mean, Putin's a bad actor, but he's not Joseph Stalin. Russia is not the Soviet Union. So our commitment to Europe is redundant. And therefore, we should tell our friends, our job's done. We've helped to restore you to prosperity and security. You take over. And, give them, let's say, a 10-year period to figure out how they're going to do that, but withdraw the United States from NATO at the end of that period. That's Europe. Let's look at the Persian Gulf. We made a similar commitment to the Persian Gulf in 1980 when Jimmy Carter promulgated the Carter Doctrine. And we said, Persian Gulf is a vital US national security interest. We began gearing up for intervention, and lots and lots and lots of interventions have ensued ever since. The biggest ones being the Afghanistan war that began in 2001 and the Iraq war that began in 2003. The object of the exercise was what? To bring stability, to spread democracy, to end militant extremism. We didn't get any of that done. I think current estimates by a reputable research institution at Brown University say we've probably spent something on the order of $7 or $8 trillion, and we haven't got the job done. So my argument would be that the militarization of policy toward the greater Middle East that began in 1980 has failed. And trying harder ain't going to make it better. So we should demilitarize US policy to the region. That doesn't mean that we ignore the Middle East. It means we rely on diplomacy rather than military action. It means we try to make ourselves an honest broker to bring about diplomatic solutions. Now, if we think the third region, East Asia, as I said earlier, I think that the rise of China has major geopolitical consequences that threaten stability. Not because the Chinese are necessarily engaged in some kind of a plan to take over the world, but people get nervous about the changing sort of balance of power. And there, I would argue that the presence that we have maintained since World War II probably contributes to stability. And therefore, we shouldn't leave. Leave Europe, yes. Leave the greater Middle East, yes. Stay in East Asia. And the point of that little sort of parable is that we need to make judgments, pragmatic judgments. What's necessary, what works, and therefore to adjust our global posture appropriately.
Thanks. Well, as promised, I am going to turn the questions over to you, our wise and esteemed audience. Couple of ways you can do that. People are already putting questions in the chat, but you can also ask your question of Professor Bacevich live. If you go down at the bottom of your screen, just to the right of center under reactions, you can raise your hand as I just did. It'll put you to the top of the list, and I will call on you in turn and put you on the screen. I would ask that you keep your questions brief so we can get to as many as possible. But I'll start off with one from the chat. And this is just about events today. This is from Krishan Mehta. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Do you believe that the news today in General Milley's testimony that intelligence indicates that Al-Qaeda could take over Afghanistan over the next 6 months, could that be another setup by the military-industrial complex to seek more funding and support from Congress to continue endless wars in the Middle East? Do you buy that intelligence that Al-Qaeda could take over Afghanistan in the next 6 months?
Oh no, I think that's absurd. It is possible, and I'm not. Let me emphasize: I'm not an expert on Islamic fundamentalism. I think it's possible that the Taliban regime may intentionally or inadvertently allow for anti-American entities to find sanctuary in Afghanistan, not take over Afghanistan, carve out a space. And we need to be very watchful in that regard. We need to communicate to the Taliban as clearly as we can that that would be unacceptable, and that were they to ignore our concerns, that they would pay a very, very heavy price. I'm not a defender of the Taliban. My guess is that the Taliban leadership is rational. That is to say, it has its own interests, its own survival, the regime's survival in mind. And therefore, that will enable us to have some leverage that can be used here. No, I don't think that somebody like Milley is going to use this occasion to say something because he's sort of scheming to figure out a way to, benefit the military-industrial complex. Brian, you made the key point. And the key point is, regardless of what the generals say, we've got the Congress shoveling money to the military. And so the real problem is why the heck, the real question is why the heck does the Congress do this? And of course, that gets you into all kinds of military-industrial complex matters. But I don't think that I am not an admirer of Milley. I think actually he should have been fired at least twice. But I don't think he's a conniver.
Well, that's good to know. I'll get right back to the questions, but just to let people know, don't be shy. Go ahead, raise your hand. Hey, Gordon Fellman, let me ask you to unmute yourself and I'll put you right up on the screen with us.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Question I want to ask Professor Bacevich is this. Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex, of course. It's been recently suggested in a number of books that the point of war is no longer to win the war, but to make money for the arms manufacturers. So the longer the war goes on, the better it is for business. War is a business, right? Just as private guns are a business to keep the gun industry in power. So my question is, how can we imagine a sane, rational, and globally safe foreign policy with the economic system that we're in?
You kind of lost me on the last part.
Oh, yes. I said, how can we imagine?
Are you saying the problem is capitalism?
Yes. Well, not the problem, but one of the major pieces of our problem is an economic system that finds war attractive. And it seems to me the F-35, the aircraft carriers, these are gigantic scams. and they're making money off them. And that's why the defense budget keeps going up. They want more money. Even Biden is willing to give them more money.
Well, okay, so arms manufacturers want to have bigger contracts to purchase weapons.
Mhm.
And their interest has nothing to do with the well-being of the United States, it has everything to do with the corporate bottom line.
Exactly.
But I would say that, I guess, maybe I misinterpret you, but that an unspoken premise here is that the military-industrial complex is the only entity that matters in the political debate to determine the nation's priorities. You know, where money should go and for what purposes. I think that there are other entities that weigh in. And it may well be that the military-industrial complex, it is true that they have a larger say than they should have, but it's not like they are the only player in the game. And I think what's required is to figure out how the other players can become more effective. I'm stumbling here, but you know, I'm sitting here thinking about, let's say, the New Deal. Time of great crisis, military-industrial complex wasn't particularly central to the crisis, but it was a moment when political leaders could engage the American people and create a political consensus to bring about substantive reform.
Yes.
And it seems to me that that offers a precedent which is at least arguably relevant to the present moment. It's not as if, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If I could go for another moment, Brian, may I would say yes and no.
Just briefly.
I think what happened with the New Deal was that one section of the Republican wealthy class decided Roosevelt had done a good thing because he kept the economic system going in their interest. Another section decided the New Deal had to be destroyed. Ronald Reagan was their first agent to try to deconstruct the New Deal. And Trump is the final kind of card in their deck. You know, do away with Social Security, do away with Medicare, do away with.
I'm not where you are. I'm not where you are.
Well, then tell me where you are. Tell me where you are.
I don't think, as a recipient of Social Security, I am not worried about losing my Social Security check. I am absolutely confident that it will, prevail. I think it is way. I think any comparison between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump is probably wrong. Reagan's conservatism was more rhetorical than it was substantive. Reagan did not dismantle the New Deal. Reagan did not make Social Security go away. Matter of fact, Reagan said, elect me and I'll shrink the size of the government because government is the problem. Government grew under Reagan. The social spending grew under Reagan. The deficit grew under Reagan. So I think one needs to take some of the rhetoric that these guys spout in order to get elected, need to take some of that with a grain of salt.
Thanks, and I will thank you, Professor Feldman. I will say that Gordon Feldman is the professor of sociology and the chairman of the Peace, Conflict, and Coexistence program over at Brandeis. Thank you for your question. I'm glad that you're not worried about your Social Security. I don't know if my Social Security check will be there.
That is a good point. You're exactly right.
But
yes.
Let's keep it going. Zarina, I'll ask you to unmute. You can put your camera on or not, whatever your preference, but go ahead with your question for Professor Bacevich.
Okay, I hope you can hear me because I'm not sure if I want to go to the window to remove the camera. It's just one more thing to do.
I hear you perfectly well.
Okay, good. So my question is, this military industrial complex, is it unique to just America, or has it been there in other empires? And also, is it currently a big point in other countries? I mean, we just saw that France was upset with Australia and US deal with UK. I forget the whole details on that, the submarines or something. And also, did the founding fathers have this principle of national security as a big thing, or is this one of those things that just came about with laissez-faire, the 1800s in America, and how great wealth is really addictive? So that's it. Thank you.
Well, I think my answer to the first question would be that no, it is not the case that the American military-industrial complex is the only one on the planet. And you just referenced a very interesting case that the agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom to sell submarines to Australia benefits the military-industrial complex in the United States and in Great Britain, and basically screwed the French, who lost out on a multi-billion-dollar effort to sell weaponry. It's also, I think, the case that the Russians have a military-industrial complex. Certainly, they did back in Soviet days. So no, it's not just us. And now I'm sorry to say I've already forgotten the second question. I do this all the time. Could you summarize it very quickly? Or Brian, do you remember the second question?
No, I'll let Zarina speak for herself. Go ahead, Zarina.
Okay, yes. I'm going to start the video too.
Oh, I got it. No,
Okay.
you were talking about did the founders
Yes.
buy into the
Yes.
existing national security concept? No, they did not. Which doesn't mean they're a bunch of good guys,
Yes.
right? My argument is that they're a bunch of shrewd guys, very shrewd. And from the earliest days of the Republic, American political leaders set out in a opportunistic way to do whatever they possibly could to expand American power. Now, the expansion of American power in the 19th century, first half of the 19th century, focused on territory.
Mm-hmm.
So there we were. We're gonna buy Louisiana. We're gonna invade Mexico. We're gonna buy Alaska. The second half of the 19th century, we're gonna go to war with Spain. So we can acquire Hawaii. So we can acquire Puerto Rico. I mean, the American statesmen were exceedingly savvy and ruthless in their determination to take our small republic of 1776 and turn it into a vast and powerful republic. So the theme of American foreign policy from the outset, from the beginning, was opportunistic expansionism. Now, I say that because, of course, when we were growing up as kids, the story was, the central theme of US foreign policy is isolationism, that America wanted nothing to do with the world.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's true that the United States wanted to keep its distance from political competitions in Europe because we didn't have any stake in them at that point. But also, by keeping Europe at arm's length, we're better able to focus on this project of expansionism in the Western Hemisphere. That's the story, I think, of US foreign policy, not isolationism that suddenly flips overnight to global leadership in World War II.
So can I add to this that it seems like the national security issue and expansion and so forth is really an imperialistic or a big sport, unfortunately. Yes, you got it. Okay.
No,
thanks.
it was imperialism. Now, because of our, we less so today, but certainly in the 19th century, where the American Revolution was the cornerstone, the point of origin, the definition of who we are and what we represent. And because the American Revolution was undertaken in opposition to an empire, to the British Empire, we cultivated this notion of ourselves as an anti-imperial republic or an anti-colonial republic. Well, go ask the Mexicans, go ask the Hawaiians, go ask the Cubans. That was all nonsense. We were in an imperial republic committed to growing the country into a great and powerful nation. That's what happens basically during the course of the 19th century.
And you also talk about the imperialism of the open door policy, especially in China, in your book. So
yeah, there's a commercial approach to this informal imperialism. Yes.
Yeah, and speaking of China, I must confess that I was looking for questions in the chat when you addressed your last zone of the world, East Asia. I'm going to sneak in one question. When you said that the United States should stay in East Asia, I have to say that and many of us here at Massachusetts Peace Action are incredibly concerned about the potential of Cold War with China becoming a shooting war with China, maybe by accident.
Rightly so.
Yeah. When you say that we need to stay in East Asia, are you talking about Wake Island, Guam, Okinawa?
I'm talking about Japan and South Korea. I mean, my argument is this. Okay, my argument is that if the United States, if U.S. policy in Asia mirrored what I suggested U.S. policy in Europe should be, let's get out. I think the effects in Asia would be destabilizing. In other words, if we tell the Japanese government, we are pulling out of Japan, we're pulling US troops out of Japan, and we are revoking our security guarantees to Japan, what would the Japanese government then do, Brian? What would
Continue
they do?
to militarize. Yeah,
Bingo.
As
I mean,
we're already seeing.
Nuclear arms race. Ditto, I think, in the Korean Peninsula. So when I say maintain a US military presence, I'm not trying to say and let's get ready to get it on with the Chinese. I'm saying that the situation is very delicate, and we need to make sure we don't do anything rash that undermines the precarious stability that exists there today. But 50 years down the road, it could be at that point that relations between the United States and China with other powers is relatively stable. And at that point, maybe it would make sense then to withdraw US forces. I just don't think that now is the moment to do that. My argument is not that, bring every last American soldier home. And we need to bring a bunch of them home, but not every last one.
And just to follow up on that, because I think it's an incredibly important point, I imagine you would support perhaps a good way to say it is a diplomatic offensive. Yes, so we could speed up the day.
Absolutely. Yes.
I've often thought
I think that, problems like the climate crisis, and this is not an original thought, but I think it's a valid, they provide the basis for conversations with the Chinese where we say, hey, we got a mutual problem here. Let's see if we can come up with a mutually agreeable decision or agreement. Easy? No.
Yeah.
I mean, not easy, but I mean, wars are difficult. Diplomacy is difficult. I'll still go with diplomacy.
Yeah, better to jaw, right? But I've often thought that if Nixon can go to China with Mao Zedong as the chairman of the Communist Party at the time, why can't Biden go to China? Or why can't President Xi come to Washington, D.C.?
Oh, they will. That'll happen. I mean, whether or not it'll be meaningful, I think is a different question. Brian, I'm going to have to go pretty soon.
Okay, great. Do you have time for,
You cut out.
Do you have time for one more?
Sure. Yep.
All right, Jim has been waiting for a while. Jim, you have the final question for Professor Bacevich.
Biden wants to continue flying drones over Afghanistan, and just like today or yesterday, the Taliban asked us to stop. So what would be your opinion on that? Thanks.
Good question.
Well, I'm not enough of a techie. And the key, we have a legitimate interest in maintaining some level of surveillance in Afghanistan. There's no reason for us to trust the Taliban. So I think the question is, what is the means to provide that surveillance that is least provocative? And I think, quite frankly, if I were the Taliban, I'd probably get annoyed if there were a bunch of American drones flying overhead. But again, there may well be other means of collecting intelligence to give us a reasonable understanding of events on the ground. And if I were the president, I would have my intel people in there, and I'd be saying, hey, come back in 2 weeks. I want that plan. It's going to cost a lot. I don't care. Tell me what that plan is. I think that would be a reasonable thing to do.
Well, thanks for spending so much time with us, Professor Bacevich. I just want to give you the last word. Perhaps a little more information about the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Glad
to do it. So we're a small think tank in Washington. I'm in Walpole, Massachusetts. The gang's down in Washington. We exist to change U.S. foreign policy. We say we stand for restraint. What that means is we're against the misuse of American military power, and we strongly favor creativity in diplomacy as a preferred way to solve problems. So, we write, we argue, we host events. We're trying to change the way Washington elites think about our role in the world. We're very young. We're only basically a little more than 2 years old. We don't take foreign money. We don't take corporate money. We are nonpartisan, transpartisan. We want friends on the right. We want friends on the left. If y'all agree with the idea of a foreign policy based on military restraint, we want to be your friends. So look us up on the internet, and if you got any questions about it, feel free to send me a question. What am I at? Bacevich at quincyinst.org.
And I'll be
Thanks.
sending out all that information.
Good.
And the quotes and the links in a follow-up email. And I encourage everyone to spread this information widely in your networks. I can't recommend the Quincy Institute enough. We've talked to Trita Parsi, Anel Sheline, Asal Rod. Many of the people that you're associated with are at QI are top notch. So
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your time. And just one last appeal. I cannot recommend this book enough. I found it incredibly readable and also provocative and prescriptive as well. You're not afraid to make suggestions on the things that we need to do to survive in this next century. So thank you once again for your time, Professor Bacevich. It was an honor to speak with you.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you
Everybody
very
have a
much.
pleasant evening. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. I'm going to let the professor go, but if you'd stay with me for just one moment, I just want to make a quick appeal. We are a grassroots organization. We rely on support from you, not just of funds, but also of your time. So if you're interested in getting more involved in our activism and planning programs like this, in crafting our asks to members of Congress and in getting out in the street and making a ruckus, I would encourage you to write me. I will put my email address right in the chat right now. And I want to invite anyone who's interested. This was a program that came out of our Middle East working group. We have several working groups. They really originate our work. We are going to be meeting on October the 14th. That's a Thursday at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And if you're interested in doing that, and I'll appeal again in the follow-up email, write back to me. We'd love to have you. We always want to bring in new people to, bring in fresh ideas and really move the work forward. So that's my little appeal. We are a membership organization. You can check us out at masspeaceaction.org. And please consider becoming a member. We truly believe in the grassroots, and we rely on people like you to help us with making the decisions. And if you're in a different part of the country, I would recommend that you go to peaceaction.org and find your local affiliates. Our sister organizations are all across the country, and they would appreciate your help as well. So please do look out in your inboxes. I will send you a copy of the recording and several relevant links. And please spread it far and wide. Spread the word as far as you can. And I really appreciate you all coming. We couldn't do it without an audience. So why don't you give yourselves a round of applause? And tomorrow night, we're going to be talking with Vijay Prashad, who is the director of the Tricontinental Institute and a scholar on China. I will send a link so you can register for that as well. That's going to be 7 p.m. tomorrow night. Another great program. Don't miss it. And with that, I will say good night and peace to you all.
Thank you.